I wasn't aware we had visitors. Waddick, you didn't tell me we had visitors.
We have visitors.
Excellent. Now that you've gone to all this trouble to get here, you should make yourself at home. Relax. Kick up your feet on the tables. I don't care they have scorch marks on them anyway.
The act of collecting carries a quiet sense of virtue. We build museums, we archive documents, we fill vaults with the things we decide are worth keeping. And in doing so, we tell ourselves a comfortable story, that to preserve something is to understand it, that the act of saving is also, somehow, an act of knowing. The Scow moves through the dark between stars and quietly asks whether that story has ever been true. From a distance, it doesn't look like much. Its exterior is weathered the way long-traveling ships get weathered, not from neglect exactly, but from exposure, from existing in space long enough that the cosmos has left its marks. Other vessels in the settled systems carry themselves with a kind of institutional clarity. A UC warship announces what it is by how it's built. A Freestar Ranger vessel has a particular lean, a practical honesty to its silhouette. The Scow announces nothing except its own accumulation. It has grown around its contents over time, and that growth has made it something genuinely unusual, a ship that feels less like a vehicle and more like a place. Captain Petrov has spent what appears to be a considerable portion of his life filling that place with the relics and artifacts of human civilization. Objects rescued from dead colonies and abandoned stations, retrieved from debris fields and the ruins of settlements that the rest of the settled systems stopped thinking about long ago. He is, by his own estimation, a man of culture, of discernment, of genuine historical appreciation, and yet standing in the corridors of the Scow, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of centuries of human life and loss, something is off. Not sinister exactly, more like an absence, a silence underneath the clutter, all of this history carefully retrieved, carefully arranged, none of it understood. The question that follows you off that ship is not a comfortable one. What does it mean to save something if the saving teaches you nothing? Walk the corridors long enough and the scale of what Petrov has assembled begins to press on you in a way that goes beyond the visual. It is not simply that there is a great deal here, though there is, shelves and cases and display arrangements filling the cargo bays and lining the passages in a layered, almost archaeological way that speaks to years of slow accretion rather than any single act of deliberate curation. It is not even the variety, which is genuinely striking. Objects from dozens of different eras and origins pressed into proximity with each other in ways that no academic institution would allow, but that produce, in their own strange fashion, a kind of accidental meaning. Old things next to older things, objects that would never have shared a room in their original context, sharing one now, because the logic of the collection has superseded the logic of history. What presses on you, underneath all of it, is the silence. Not auditory silence. The Scow carries the sounds that all ships carry, the hum of systems and the faint mechanical rhythm of recycled air moving through corridors. The silence is something else. It belongs to things that cannot speak for themselves. Every object here represents a human moment, a decision made under pressure, a loss absorbed in the body, a reach toward something better, a retreat from something worse. Every object was made by someone, used by someone, eventually left behind by someone whose name is now gone. The corridors of the Scow are full of these compressed human moments, stacked and organized and preserved, and entirely mute, because no one aboard is asking them anything. To stand in the Scow is to feel the difference between the presence of history and the presence of the past. History is organized, categorized, stripped of the moisture that made it alive. The past is what remains when the organization is set aside, the texture of actual human experience, the weight of real consequence, the thing that speaks to you from the evidence if you allow it to. Petrov has accumulated an enormous quantity of history. He has been careful with it, kept it in good condition, tended it with genuine devotion, and in doing so, he has successfully converted it from the past, from something that makes demands of you, into history, something safely inert. The philosopher's version of the problem would frame it this way. Petrov confuses the container with the content. He preserves the physical vessel of meaning, while the meaning itself, the lived experience, the causal chain, the lesson encoded in every disaster and near miss, evaporates with nobody noticing. But the Scow is not a thought experiment. It is a concrete, functioning, traveling expression of a tendency that runs through human civilization, like a structural fault line, repeated at every scale from the individual collector to the galactic empire. Petrov didn't invent this tendency. He simply perfected it and built it into a home. To understand why, you have to understand what kind of man he is. And to understand that, you have to set aside the easy readings. He is not a villain. He is not cruel. He does not use his collection as a weapon or a tool of domination. He is something more interesting, and, in a certain light, more troubling. He is a man who loves the past with complete sincerity and possesses it without the slightest transformation. Petrov is intelligent. This is the first thing you notice in conversation with him, and it matters because it closes off the simplest explanation for the Scow's particular failure. He is not preserving without understanding because he lacks the capacity to understand. He can tell you where a given object came from, approximately when it was made, what it was likely used for, why it is difficult to find now. These are genuine forms of knowledge. They require research, a cultivated eye, sustained attention of the kind that most people in the settled systems simply do not have the patience for. But there is a difference between knowing the biography of an object and allowing that biography to interrogate your own. Petrov is a master of the former and appears constitutionally uninterested in the latter. He knows where things come from. He does not ask what they are asking of him in return. This is not unusual. In fact, it is the dominant mode through which most people in the settled systems relate to the past. The United Colonies invokes its founding and its wars to justify its authority, not to examine it. The Free Star Collective invokes Solomon Coe's original vision and the sacrifices of the colony war to justify its continued insistence on sovereignty, not to ask whether that sovereignty has delivered what it promised or at what ongoing cost. Across the factions and across the systems, history is deployed as argument rather than engaged as inquiry. The past is useful as long as it supports what you have already decided. The moment it threatens to require genuine revision, the record gets sealed and the display case gets locked. Petrov is the pure, individualized version of this civilization-wide habit. He has made it literal. He has built a cabinet of civilization and locked it. And he tends it with the devotion of someone who genuinely believes that tending is enough. The psychology of the collector, when you examine it closely, is not primarily about greed. Greed is simpler than this, and, in its own way, more honest. The collector's relationship with their collection contains a kind of love, a reaching toward the past that is fundamentally about connection, about the desire to hold something that has moved through time and survived, to be part of a chain that extends backward further than any single life can reach. You can feel this in Petrov when he speaks about what he has assembled. The pride in his voice is not the pride of someone who has won a competition. It is the pride of someone who has successfully maintained a relationship, who has kept faith with something. The tragedy is that the relationship is entirely one-directional. He gives the objects his attention, his resources, his organizational intelligence, his time. He does not ask them to give him anything in return except the satisfaction of being owned. A relationship in which only one party speaks is not, in any meaningful sense, a relationship. It is a performance of one. The crew moves through the corridors with the practiced efficiency of people who have lived inside this environment long enough that it no longer registers as remarkable. Based on what we can observe aboard the Scow, the objects appear to have become background, part of the architecture of their working life, no more remarkable than the bulkheads themselves. Whether that's indifference or simply the inevitable result of prolonged proximity to anything, it amounts to the same thing. This could well be the most honest possible portrait of what happens to preserved history over time when it is not actively questioned. It becomes furniture. It becomes the thing that is always there, which means it is never actually seen. What makes Petrov genuinely interesting as a figure, and what elevates the Scow above the level of simple symbol, is that he is not cynical about any of this. He loves his collection. He returns to particular objects in particular moods, the way other people return to particular books or particular places. The love is real. The problem is what he does with the love. He converts it into inventory. He takes the feeling of connection to the past, a feeling that could be the beginning of genuine engagement, and channels it entirely into the act of owning. The love of history, transposed into the logic of acquisition, the feeling of being moved, organized into a catalog. Walk through enough of the settled systems, and you begin to understand how common this transposition is. The love of something does not protect you from misusing it. In some cases, the more intensely we love a thing, the more thoroughly we can extract it from context and place it somewhere controlled, somewhere safe, somewhere it cannot ask anything of us. Devotion, when it is not balanced by a willingness to be challenged, becomes the most effective possible barrier between you and what you claim to care about. Petrov's devotion to his collection is, in its own quiet way, a kind of defense against everything the collection could teach him. The more tightly he holds it, the less chance it has of holding him back. Consider what the Scow actually is in practical terms. A mobile vault. Not a library, not a research station, not an archive designed around access and inquiry. A vault. The distinction is not merely administrative. It reflects the fundamental logic of what the collection is for. A library is built around the idea that the knowledge inside it should move outward, should reach people who can use it, should circulate and generate new thought. A vault is built around the idea that the contents must be protected from the outside world, preserved in their current state, kept exactly as they are. The Scow moves through space and collects and maintains, and the direction of that movement is always inward. Things come in. Nothing goes out except for sale, which is its own kind of conversion, the conversion of historical significance into economic value, the final reduction of the past to a transaction. This is the moment when Petrov's philosophy becomes most legible. The collection is not ultimately about history. It is about the collector. The objects inside the Scow exist as extensions of Petrov's own sense of significance, each rare item confirming the uniqueness of his eye, each unusual artifact validating the seriousness of his project. The love of history in this configuration is really a form of self-love at a remove. The past is a mirror in which Petrov sees reflected a version of himself that he finds satisfying, cultivated, discerning, singular. The past is not allowed to speak because the past, if it spoke, might say something that disrupted that reflection. There is one more quality worth examining before we open the hold of what this collection actually contains. Petrov is a man who believes the effort of retrieval is morally equivalent to understanding. He went out there, after all. He found these things, lifted them from debris fields and dead stations, brought them back from silence. That effort is real. It cost something: time, resources, the particular grinding monotony of salvage work dressed up in the language of cultural preservation. And Petrov, like most people who have paid a genuine cost for something, has understandably concluded that paying the cost was itself the meaningful act, that the work of getting here justifies the situation of being here. But the effort of retrieval is not the same as the work of understanding, and the cost of preservation is not the same as the price of learning. The Scow has paid one and avoided the other, and the corridors are full of the evidence of that avoidance, polished and tagged and quietly waiting. To understand what the Scow might contain and why it matters, you need to understand the history a ship like this would have absorbed. Petrov runs a salvage operation at civilizational scale. His collection is described as rare valuables and historical antiquities, gathered from the margins of the settled systems where memory collects alongside debris. The specific contents of his display cases are never fully cataloged. But given what we know about his methodology and his range, it would be difficult to imagine a ship like the Scow having moved through these systems without accumulating objects that touch the great ruptures of post-Earth human history. What those objects might be and what they might carry is worth thinking through, because the history Petrov operates inside of is a history of lessons encoded and ignored. Humanity left Earth not in triumph, but in flight. The grav drive, developed by Dr. Victor Isa in 2138, gave the species the means to cross interstellar distances. And that was fortunate, because by 2150, the announcement had already come. Earth's atmosphere was failing. The gravitational physics that had governed the planet's stability for billions of years had been disrupted by the same technology that was now carrying humanity to safety. By 2203, Earth was uninhabitable, a world that had sheltered the species for its entire existence, gone in less than a human lifetime. Hold that timeline for a moment. Less than a human lifetime, from the announcement to the end. Children born to parents who still believed Earth could be saved grew up in time to watch the last transports leave. The grief of that is not abstract. It is bodily, generational, the kind that gets carried in the bones without ever finding adequate language. And whatever objects in the Scow originate from those final Earth decades, if any do, and the probability seems reasonable given his scope, the equipment, the personal effects, the things people carried onto evacuation ships and never set down again, those objects would carry that grief compressed into their physical form. They also carry something else, the contradiction at the heart of humanity's greatest crisis. The grav drive opened the stars. The grav drive killed the Earth. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and they do not resolve into a clean lesson. The technology that caused the catastrophe also enabled the survival. The instrument of death was the instrument of escape. What do you do with that? How do you build a civilization in its aftermath that has genuinely reckoned with the implications, rather than preserving the grief while quietly setting aside the implication? The United Colonies emerged from those early post-Exodus years, founded in 2159, with New Atlantis established on Jemison in 2160, and declared the political capital a year later. A new center of human civilization built from scratch on an alien world by people who had just watched their original home become unlivable. You might expect such a civilization, born from that particular grief, carrying that particular lesson, to have internalized something meaningful about the relationship between technological capability and civilizational consequence, about the necessity of building accountability into the structure of expansion before expansion kills you again. What the United Colonies actually built was a government of considerable administrative power and considerable military ambition. A civilization focused primarily on establishing and maintaining dominance over the new human territory, on codifying its claim to be the legitimate inheritor and guardian of the human project. The lesson of Earth, that the reach of power must be understood and bounded before it is deployed, was not reflected in the structure of what came after. The lesson was preserved in memorials and official statements, and in a genuine deep grief that many UC citizens still carry, generations removed. But the structural lesson, the one that might have produced a different kind of civilization, was largely set aside in favor of the more urgent project of consolidation. Objects from these early colonial decades, if they rest somewhere in the Scow's corridors, carry that contradiction. Items from the ships that made the first crossings, equipment from the earliest settlements before humanity had the range for the further systems. These things would represent the full impossible weight of that moment when the species chose the future and lost the past simultaneously. They carry both the grief of what was left behind and the momentum of what was being built. And in that combination, they encode a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. What precisely was learned from Earth's end? Then there are the objects from the middle period, the consolidation of the settled systems, the rising tensions between the United Colonies and the Free Star Collective, which Solomon Coe had brought together in 2189 through a voluntary alliance with the Volii system, a deliberate counterweight to UC authority, a different model of what civilization in space could look like. For a time, the two models coexisted, their differences managed by diplomacy and distance. But distance always shrinks in the end. The Colony War. 2308 to 2311. 3 years of conflict across the settled systems, one of the most destructive wars in post-Earth human history. It ended at the Battle of Cheyenne, where Free Star forces prevailed and forced the United Colonies to recognize Free Star sovereignty definitively. Thousands dead, systems scarred in ways that took generations to recover from. The political landscape permanently reshaped by 3 years of choices that, examined from any distance at all, looked like choices that neither side had to make. Choices that each side made anyway, because the structure of competition between their models of civilization had been building pressure toward exactly this kind of rupture for decades, and because pressure, when it is not examined and addressed, eventually finds its own release. Among the things that happened in those 3 years were moments of individual human experience that never made it into the official historiography. Soldiers on both sides who made impossible choices under impossible conditions. Colonists whose lives were destroyed by the decisions of people they never met. Civilians who carried the aftermath of the war, long after the war itself was declared over. If objects from this period have found their way into Petrov's collection, and given the scope of his acquisition and the depth of the debris fields he works from, it seems reasonable to infer that some have. They encode one of the starkest possible lessons in the post-Earth archive, that two civilizations, each carrying the memory of Earth's destruction, each having inherited the grief and the warnings of that catastrophe, could still arrive at a full-scale shooting war within a century and a half of leaving their dead homeworld behind. That the memory of catastrophe is not, by itself, sufficient protection against catastrophe. That something more than memory is required. They sit in the dark of the Scow, tagged, cataloged, silent. And then there is the artifact. This is where the Scow stops being merely a fascinating example of a larger human pattern and becomes something more pointed. Because among all the objects Petrov has assembled, the relics and the equipment and the personal effects and the fragments of a dozen different eras, he has one that belongs to an entirely different category of significance, one that is not historical in any conventional sense at all. Petrov has one of the artifacts. The capital letter matters here because these objects, geometrically intricate, ancient beyond any human reckoning, emanating gravitational signatures that have no natural explanation, are not artifacts of human history. They predate human history so thoroughly that the comparison does not hold. They are not remnants of civilizations that humanity destroyed or outgrew or forgot. They are remnants of something else entirely, something that existed before humanity reached for the stars, before humanity existed at all, and that left these devices scattered across the cosmos with a purpose that the best minds at Constellation have been working to understand carefully and not without personal cost. To be near one of the artifacts is to feel something that resists ordinary description. There is a quality of presence to them that goes beyond their physical strangeness, a sense of something at the edge of comprehension pressing against ordinary consciousness, the suggestion of a question being asked in a register that human language was not built to receive. They do not behave as historical objects behave. They are not inert. They carry the suggestion of ongoing significance, of a story that is not finished, of a signal still being transmitted by something that does not know or does not care that the receivers went quiet a very long time ago. Each artifact exists as part of something larger. They connect to each other, and through each other to a phenomenon that Constellation has come to call the unity, something operating at a scale and along dimensions that current human understanding cannot fully account for. To hold one artifact in isolation is to hold a single word from a sentence written in a language no human being has yet managed to translate. The word has weight, has form, carries some quality that suggests it means something significant. But without the sentence, without the grammar, without the accumulated context that transforms isolated marks into meaning, it tells you nothing. Or rather, it tells you everything in a language you have not yet learned. Petrov is fascinated by the artifact. That much is apparent from the care with which it is stored, the pride with which he will, under the right persuasion, show it to you. He recognizes that it is unlike anything else in his collection. He knows it defies easy classification, that it sits in the room differently from everything around it, that it carries some quality which his trained eye cannot quite resolve into a familiar category. The fascination is real. What appears to be absent is any framework for following that fascination somewhere. This is perhaps the sharpest possible expression of the entire pattern we have been tracing. He has acquired an object of potentially incalculable significance, an object that exists at the outer edge of what humanity understands about the cosmos, and the most it seems to have produced in him is the satisfaction of difficult possession. He has noted its unusual properties, recognized its rarity, appreciated its strangeness as a collector appreciates all strangeness, as something that increases the distinction of the collection. And he has given it a shelf. The irony reaches a depth that is genuinely difficult to sit with. Here is a man who has dedicated his life to preserving history, who has gone to considerable effort and expense to retrieve the evidence of human experience and maintain it with genuine care, who holds in his possession the one object in his collection that is not a record of the past, but an active question about the nature of reality itself, the one object that demands something that preservation cannot supply. And the best response he appears capable of is fascination without inquiry. How would the framework get there? The artifacts do not announce themselves in the terms that a collector's training prepares for. They do not arrive with documentation or provenance or any legible signal beyond the sense of something pressing, something waiting, something operating on a different frequency than everything else in the room. And the only way to begin approaching what they actually are requires asking a kind of question that Petrov's entire worldview has been structured to avoid. You cannot catalog your way to understanding an artifact. You cannot acquire your way toward its meaning. What they demand is something fundamentally different, a willingness to sit with a question that has no comfortable resolution, to allow what you are examining to reorganize the framework through which you examine everything, to remain in genuine unknowing long enough that the unknowing begins to teach you something. Based on everything we can observe in how Petrov operates, that posture appears to be the one thing his worldview was not built to accommodate. This is what learning from the past actually looks like. Not preservation, not ownership, not careful, devoted maintenance of the evidence, but the willingness to be changed by the encounter, to let the thing you are holding hold you back. Constellation, when they learned that Petrov has the artifact, moved to retrieve it, not because of its rarity or its monetary value, but because they believe it is part of something larger that demands to be assembled and understood, that cannot yield its meaning in isolation. The contrast between Petrov's relationship to the artifact and Constellation's relationship to the same object is the contrast made as concrete as possible between the Scow's entire operating philosophy and the alternative the story is slowly building toward. Between the museum and the inquiry, between the archive and the conversation, between the human tendency to keep the past and the rarer, harder human tendency to listen to it. Step back from the Scow for a moment, widen the frame. What Petrov does with his collection, the Settled Systems does with its history. The pattern is not similar, it is identical. The only difference is scale. Earth died, and humanity carried the grief of it into the stars. That grief is real, and it would be wrong to minimize it. You can feel its weight in the way you see citizens speak of the home world, with a quiet reverence that goes beyond political rhetoric, that touches something close to bereavement. The museums preserving images of what Earth looked like in its final years. The memorials marking the last evacuation. Families who still keep a small quantity of Earth's soil, passed between generations as the most precious kind of inheritance, because it is the only inheritance that cannot be replicated or manufactured or approximated by anything the new worlds have to offer. The loss of Earth has been preserved with extraordinary care. It is one of the most thoroughly curated catastrophes in human history. And yet the conditions that produced it followed humanity to the settled systems with perfect fidelity. The tendency to prioritize technological development over its consequences. The assumption that greater capability equals greater safety. The willingness to extract from a system until the system fails, and then move to the next system. The grav drive that disrupted Earth's gravitational stability was not reconsidered after Earth died. Its use was not restructured, its deployment not governed by any new framework of accountability or caution. It was expanded, refined, made faster and cheaper and more available, in service of the same logic of expansion that had characterized human civilization for as long as civilization had existed. Earth was mourned. Earth's lesson was not applied. This is not a small failure. This is the central structural failure of post-Exodus humanity, the belief that grief is the same as learning, that to feel the weight of what was lost is equivalent to understanding why it was lost and to changing accordingly. The Scow operates on exactly this belief. Petrov feels the weight of his collection. He returns to it regularly, maintains it with devotion, allows himself to be moved by particular objects in particular moods. And nothing changes. The collection grows. The weight grows. The transformation does not come. The colony war follows the same logic. Both sides built their memorials. Both sides preserved their accounting of what happened. The UC has its veterans, its war narratives, its official historiography of a conflict it fought for reasons it still considers legitimate. The Free Star Collective has the colony war, woven into the fabric of its founding mythology, the moment when resistance to centralized authority was tested and held, when the original vision proved strong enough to survive direct military challenge. The war is commemorated with sincerity on both sides by people who were genuinely shaped by it. What neither side appears to have done is fundamentally question the systems and assumptions that made the war inevitable. The UC remains a centralized authority with enormous military capability and an institutional tendency toward expansion and control. The Free Star Collective remains a coalition defined largely by what it opposes: centralized governance, UC authority, with its own tendency toward insularity and mythologization, its own resistance to examining whether the freedom it was founded to protect has been evenly distributed. Both carry the colony war the way Petrov carries his relics, with great care, with genuine pride, with an absolute minimum of transformation. The Crimson Fleet, founded by Jasper Crix, enacts what might seem like the opposite of this pattern, a deliberate rejection of institutional memory, a life organized around the refusal to be bound by society's claimed lessons. But burning history and refusing to learn from it arrive at precisely the same destination. The fleet is as thoroughly trapped in a cycle as anyone else in the settled systems. The cycle of extraction, violence, and eventual dissolution that has characterized piracy in every civilization that has ever produced it. The rejection of memory is not freedom from it. You cannot escape a pattern by refusing to acknowledge that the pattern exists. What Crix built is not liberation from the civilizational cycle. It is the civilizational cycle operating outside the law rather than within it, but following the same underlying logic all the same. Across the settled systems, conflicts and catastrophes recur with a regularity that suggests something structural. Not a conspiracy, not a design, not even necessarily a failure of individual will. Something deeper, a collective orientation toward the evidence of the past that processes it as heritage rather than instruction. That allows it to be felt without allowing it to be applied. The Scow is not an anomaly within this civilization. The Scow is its clearest, most concentrated expression. When you stand in those corridors and feel the weight of what surrounds you, you are not feeling the failure of one eccentric collector. You are feeling the accumulated failure of a species that is very, very good at keeping records and remarkably resistant to being changed by them. There is a particular quality to this failure that makes it hard to address. It does not look like failure from the inside. From the inside, it looks like devotion to heritage, to memory, to the project of ensuring that the past is not lost. And that devotion is not false. It is real, and it does something genuinely valuable. It maintains the raw material of potential learning, keeps it available, ensures that the evidence does not disappear entirely. The memorials matter. The archives matter. Even the Scow matters in this limited but real sense. The tragedy is not that these things exist. It is that they are mistaken for the whole of what is required, when they are only, at best, the beginning of it. There is something worth noticing in the specific way the UC memorializes Earth's end, because it contains within it the precise mechanism by which grief is converted into heritage and heritage into justification. The loss of Earth is invoked, regularly and sincerely, as the founding wound of human civilization in space. The event that defines everything that came after it, the catastrophe that makes the project of the United Colonies not merely practical, but morally urgent. Without Earth, without that loss, the UC's claim to be the guardian of humanity's future would be merely administrative. The wound gives the claim its weight. But notice what this does to the wound itself. It converts grief into political purpose. The memory of Earth becomes useful for authority, useful for legitimacy, useful for the argument that centralized governance is not merely preferable, but necessary. And a memory that has become useful has also become managed. It has been given a function, which means it can no longer function as anything else. The grief that might have asked whether the UC's model of power was the right model, whether the logic of expansion and control was precisely the logic that needed to be questioned. That grief has been absorbed into the justification for the very things it might otherwise have challenged. Constellation is not perfect. It would be too easy and too false to position it as the pure counterpoint to everything the Scow represents. The people who make up Constellation carry their own assumptions, their own frameworks, their own inherited blindnesses. They are human, which means they are also capable of the tendency we have been tracing, the tendency to organize the past around what is already believed rather than allowing the past to reorganize what is believed. But Constellation represents something different, not in its results necessarily, not as the story stands at any given moment in the pursuit of the artifacts, but in its fundamental orientation toward the unknown. And orientation matters more than it is generally given credit for. The angle at which you approach a question determines which kinds of answers you are even capable of receiving. Constellation began as an explorer's organization. Its founding commitment was to knowledge, not the knowledge of strategic advantage, not the knowledge of historical legitimacy, not the knowledge of how to exploit new systems for resources or territory, the knowledge of what is actually out there, what the cosmos actually contains, what humanity does not yet know, and might spend a lifetime pursuing. Sarah Morgan, who leads the organization in the present era, carries this commitment with a quality of attention that is distinctive, a focused, unhurried seriousness that reads, on first encounter, more like grief than enthusiasm. She leads an organization that has survived by the skin of its convictions, whose membership has dwindled as the broader settled systems move past the age of pure exploration into the age of consolidation and commerce. And she has not allowed the organization to become something else in order to survive. This is not a small thing. It is, in fact, quite difficult to maintain the original posture of a project when the surrounding civilization has decided that posture is no longer practical. Morgan has done it not through stubbornness, but through something more considered, a genuine belief that the questions Constellation was founded to pursue are not merely interesting, but necessary. That a civilization which stops asking what it does not know is a civilization that has already begun its long decline, even if the decline is not yet visible. What Constellation demands of itself, and of anyone who moves through the story alongside it, is the thing that Petrov's collection cannot supply and does not try to: genuine engagement with the possibility of being wrong, with the possibility that what you think you know is insufficient, that the old frameworks need to be held loosely enough that new information can enter. Vladimir Saul monitors the settled systems from the eye, tracking anomalies, temples, and artifact locations, feeding the coordinates back to those on the ground. He works with the patience of someone who has accepted that the map he is drawing may not make sense until a great deal more of it exists. He does not push toward false completion. He holds the partial picture without rushing to fill the gaps with invention. This is a harder discipline than it sounds. Barrett approaches each new piece of information about the artifacts with an enthusiasm that is real but not shallow. Beneath the energy is a genuine willingness to be surprised, to have previous theories displaced by new evidence, to arrive at a conclusion different from the one he started with. These are not trivial qualities. In a civilization defined by the tendency to confirm rather than inquire, the willingness to be genuinely surprised is almost radical. When the artifacts enter the picture, Constellation responds to them in a way that makes the contrast with Petrov unmistakable. They do not catalog the artifacts. They gather them. Yes, there is accumulation involved, and honesty requires acknowledging that. But the gathering is in service of assembly rather than possession. Each artifact retrieved is not an endpoint, but a step in an ongoing inquiry whose destination is not yet understood. They sit with the artifacts. They allow the experience of proximity to them, the disorientation, the sense of something vast and genuinely incomprehensible pressing against the edges of ordinary perception, to change their understanding of what they are pursuing. They treat the discomfort of not knowing not as a problem to be resolved by reclassification, but as the most honest possible signal that they are near something real. This is what learning from the past actually looks like. Not the preservation of evidence, not the construction of heritage, but the willingness to be found wrong by what you encounter, to let the thing you're examining speak back, and to change your position when it does. The contrast between Petrov and Constellation is ultimately not a contrast between a bad person and good people. It is a contrast between two postures toward the unknown. One posture says, I will find the unknown, contain it, give it a tag and a shelf, and the work will be complete. The other says, I will find the unknown, sit with it, allow it to remain unknown for as long as it needs to, and let that sustained uncertainty teach me something I could not have anticipated. The first posture is more comfortable. The second posture is more honest. And in the world the artifacts belong to, in the register in which they operate, at the scale of what they are asking, only the second posture has any chance of arriving anywhere worth arriving. Walk back to the Scow one more time. Stand in one of those corridors and let the weight of what surrounds you settle into the room. What is remarkable about this place is not the collection itself, but the particular quality of silence underneath it. The Scow is full, in every direction, of compressed human moments. Every object here represents a life, a choice, a consequence. Every object was made by someone, mattered to someone, survived someone. The accumulated weight of all that compressed experience should be deafening, and somehow it is not. It is quiet, quieter in its own way than the emptiness of deep space, because emptiness is honest about being empty. The corridors of the Scow are full of something that is pretending to have been heard. This is the tragedy the Scow is quietly enacting as it moves between the stars. Not the tragedy of deliberate cruelty, not the tragedy of indifference, but the tragedy of well-intentioned incomprehension. Petrov cares for his collection, and that care, which could be the beginning of genuine engagement, has calcified into something else. The pride of ownership, the satisfaction of completion, the comfort of a past that has been successfully contained. The Starborn offer the most extreme version of the pattern, and in doing so, its most haunting implication. Those who pass through the unity and emerge on the other side carry the accumulated memory of multiple lives. They have, in the most literal possible sense, lived through the consequences of human decisions more than once. They have seen cycles complete. They have watched the same conflicts arise from the same conditions, the same catastrophes follow from the same unchecked assumptions. Humanity build and lose and rebuild and lose again across iterations of the same essential story. They carry within them the evidence of repetition in a form more direct and undeniable than any museum or archive could supply. And still the cycles continue. Still the questions go unanswered. Still the artifact sits on Petrov's shelf unexamined alongside the evidence of 3 centuries of unlearned lessons. The Starborn's existence implies something that is genuinely difficult to sit with. That even direct experience of the past, even memory that is not metaphorical but literal, carried intact across lifetimes, does not automatically produce wisdom. That repetition and learning are not the same thing. That experience alone is not sufficient. Something else is required. Some choice, some act of genuine engagement with what has been lived through, some willingness to be transformed rather than merely informed. And that something cannot be externally supplied. It has to be chosen every time against the considerable gravitational pull of the familiar, against the very human preference for a past that confirms rather than challenges, against the reflex repeated across every scale of human organization, from the individual collector to the civilization itself, to preserve the evidence of what we have been through, rather than allowing it to change what we become. This is perhaps the deepest implication of everything the Scow represents. The surface question, why doesn't humanity learn from the past, is obvious enough the moment you walk into those corridors. The deeper question, the one the artifacts are asking in a register that most people have not yet learned to hear, is, what would learning actually require? Not better preservation, not more thorough curation, not more memorials or more archives or more ships like the Scow, gathering more evidence with more devotion. Something different, something harder. The willingness to let what you find change the framework through which you find things. The willingness to approach the past not as a resource to be managed, but as a relationship to be entered. One in which the past has claims on you, makes demands of you, requires something from you that goes beyond the comfort of possession. The Scow keeps moving. Petrov keeps collecting. The objects in those corridors keep their silence. But the artifact, the one that does not belong among the relics, the one that carries a question older than the human species and stranger than anything the settled systems has been willing to seriously contemplate, that one will not stay quiet forever. It has been waiting a very long time. It is accustomed to waiting, but it is not designed for waiting. It is designed for something else entirely, and sooner or later, in the hands of someone willing to ask the right question, in the presence of a mind willing to remain in genuine uncertainty long enough to hear the answer, it will make itself understood. The question is not whether that moment will come. The question is what kind of attention you bring to it when it does. Whether the thing you find yourself holding is something you own or something you are answering. If these questions have found you, if the silence underneath the clutter feels a little less like quiet and a little more like something waiting to speak, then stay close. The archive is deep, and the archive is patient.